So, good morning. My name is Tyrese West. It is nice to have you here. Thank you for joining me. I have a couple of questions um, for you. Considering you're a professor of psychology at the University of Akron, I wanted to ask you, how important do you think mental health is to students?
How important is mental health to students?
Yes.
Okay. So, yeah, and not only do I teach at the University of Akron psychology courses part time, I'm also the clinical director of a mental health agency here in Akron, Ohio, called Minority Behavioral Health Group. So, mental health is something that I recognize and specialize in as it relates to how I understand the experiences that we have. And when we're talking about students and just the life changes that students go through on a natural basis, just life changes, deciding a major, entering a certain phase of life, on top of some of the other things that are going on in the climate, I would say mental health is something that's very important that we need to pay attention to and consider and make sure we're having conversations and even providing resources around it, whether students are aware or are expressing direct influence or experiences of mental health.
I agree. I think one of the most common things for students is, combating stress and anxiety. So, what are some more common mental health problems that you see in students and also in the community?
Yeah, stress, which is a physiological response to stressors that we experience. School could be one, but in terms of mental health diagnoses, we do see a lot of depression, we see a lot of anxiety, and a lot of what's been happening across the country. We've been seeing a lot of post trauma responses, which is post traumatic stress disorder or even adjustment disorder with mixed mood, anxiety, depression, or conduct experiences. So people are responding to the environment and to the climate in a way that is impacting their mental well-being, and whether that's depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress symptoms, it just depends on the person's ability to cope, recognize what's happening, and how they're processing that information that matters, what they end up with, whether it's more depression, anxiety, or post-trauma symptoms.
Honestly, I think that a lot of times we become a literal product of our environment. Wherever you are, whatever you see, whatever you hear, you start doing and you start emulating that in your actions and in your thoughts. So what do you think are some positive things that we can do to combat things like stress and anxiety?
Yeah, the first thing we have to have an awareness of it. I think, and you're absolutely correct. I agree with that statement 100% that we are products of our environment, and sometimes we are predisposed genetically to mental health disorders. And just because there's a family history or a family linkage that we might be susceptible or at risk, it's the environment that really determines if it's going to manifest into a full-blown mental health disorder. So I agree with you 100% that our environment is key and critical in terms of if we experience, how it manifests, and then again, how we respond to stress, anxiety, and depression. Um, so the environment is critical. In terms of what we should do about it, number one, we have to be aware that that's what it is. If we can't accurately call the experience for what it is, then what we're going to do is going to either be detrimental, it's not going to be helpful at all, or things could get far worse. So we have to be aware and have conversations. Taking care of our bodies is the most important thing that we can do for our mental health right now. Again, with everything going on and how stress attacks the body physiologically, the more self care we can employ, like eating good meals, getting adequate sleep, making sure we have physical outlets where we're exercising and stretching and doing things physical, those social connections and outlets, our spiritual connections and outlets. So we want to make sure that we're being holistic in terms of how we're responding to everything we are experiencing from a physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual perspective.
I completely agree. But given the circumstances of the pandemic, having that social outlet and that way of getting out there and exercising and eating right, that has become a little bit challenging because of the isolation that the pandemic has brought, right?
Mm-hmm.
So under these conditions, what do you think that people can do, to stay connected with each other, and how do you think it helps the brain process these problems? Like for example, post more. How did you describe it? What was the word you used? Psycho.
The post-trauma responses?
Yeah. Like I forgot what you. Physiological.
Oh.
The more physiological response, like
Mm-hmm.
post-traumatic stress disorder, something that's brought on by trauma, which we have
Mm-hmm.
seen a lot of in
Yes.
this year. You know what I
Yes.
mean? So, how do people how do you process that? Like, how do you process trauma, and how do you recognize it?
Yeah. So what happens is when we are exposed to something traumatic, and I also use the term disturbing because most people don't consider certain events traumatic because it could be the norm, it could be what they're used to. So sometimes trauma can be relative to the person's experience. So what I like to say is, if you call it trauma, absolutely we'll go with trauma, but most people, more times than not, will say, no, I haven't experienced the trauma. But when you start to talk about certain experiences and certain events and their reactions to it, it is a post-trauma response. So then they're saying, oh, okay, maybe I am traumatized. And then just some of the stigma or negative connotation that come with the word trauma. Most people don't want to be seen or viewed as a victim. So they may reject this whole idea of being traumatized or experiencing a trauma. Nevertheless, in terms of how our bodies respond to it physiologically, it does determine if it is a post-trauma response. And so when we experience something that's disturbing, our bodies go into the fight or flight response, or sometimes we freeze. So either, we do things to kind of fight it, we do things to avoid it and run from it, or we do nothing at all and we're just in a state of shock and we stand still. And when our bodies are responding to that, it is definitely a post-trauma response. And what happens to the brain is our amygdala, which is controls our emotions, and especially things like anxiety and anger, it gets overly stimulated. And so people are responding out of emotion, whether that emotion is leading to avoidance, or that emotion is leading to fighting, whether it's unhealthy maladaptive things like aggression, violence, or self-harm types of behaviors. And so the brain shuts down our prefrontal cortex, which is the part of our brain that allows us to make reason, to logic, to make sense of, and to think logically about the experience. So we want to actually have the emotional experience, but we also want to be able to think logically through it, where we can come up with a balanced decision or reaction versus either just doing things that are purely logical or doing things that are purely emotional. Because when we do that, another area of life or how we're responding to that gets lost or missed.
I think so too. The brain has a way of protecting itself and the body from trauma. You know what I
Absolutely.
mean?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people tend to use that to their advantage by not addressing the trauma that they've experienced. I know, for example, my girlfriend has been through a lot of trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing that she does is she acknowledges it. And it can make her seem socially, awkward. You know what I'm saying? Because like she can address the problems that she's had. And in a room when she talks about her mental issues, a lot of people look at her like, wow, it tends to shape their judgment of her. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? So what do you think we can teach people about mental health that is less strenuous and less stigmatized? You know what I mean? Like, what do you think are some important things that can make it, can change the status quo for addressing mental health?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is that we have to normalize it. It is unfortunately a common experience. When you just think about the collective experiences that we're having, some of the traumatic things that we're all being exposed to, whether it's via social media or other kind of media platforms, whether it happens in our personal home, in our communities, we are experiencing some traumatic things right? And so we have to be able to normalize that we're going to have responses that's going to impact us, whether it's depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress, or we're just going through adjustment, some acute crises that we're trying to work through. So A, we have to be aware of it. B, we have to normalize it. C, we have to feel comfortable to talk about it, and not just talk about it, but to share what our experiences are and then seek help. Understand that there is support, and a lot of times support come in the form of going to therapy, going to counseling, and or taking medication. Unfortunately, sometimes that is a real option because anxiety is so heightened at this point. People are having a difficult time adjusting. Everybody's routine has shifted to some degree with the pandemic. To get back to your earlier comment, and the things that we were once accustomed to having access to, we no longer have access to those things. So you're right, we have to be creative and use what we can in our homes, within the safety of our private communities within our homes, to make sure we're also stimulating some of those outlets. So, and it's the change that everyone is having a difficult time adjusting to, right? Because even if you went, for example, if you went to a gym for physical outlet to work out and you had a routine and it was working for you, that's great. But not being able to have that same level of access, it doesn't mean you can't do certain exercises in your home. So it's the adjustment and the change that people are having difficulty with. Sometimes it is limited access or resources. Absolutely, we've all been impacted in that way. But there are certain things that we can do within our homes if we think more creatively and broaden our scope. That could also kind of help balance this thing. So I just think that the awareness, having the conversations, um, understanding, to reduce the stigma, there has to be an understanding that this is a common experience. It's a normal experience. It's not abnormal. People aren't crazy. People are having natural responses to the environment. And we can't do much to change the environment right now. So what we have to do is put our energy and focus into self-care and being intentional about what our rituals and routine are on a daily basis, who our support systems are, and how to access those resources, to make sure that we are asking for help and letting people know, like, hey, I'm not okay. And we all need to do that. I'm not okay. I'm not okay. And we should be able to validate that because we're not okay. There's a lot happening that's very stressful and very impactful. And if we don't acknowledge that, normalize it, have conversations about it, and come up with creative solutions collectively together, then it's going to only heighten and worsen the conditions that we're already facing.
I agree. I know me myself, my entire schedule has been thrown off, and I hate that. Before the pandemic hit, I used to be able to get up like 6 o'clock in the morning, eat breakfast, go to the gym, go to class, come back and study, finish my homework, and be able to have that all done, and my entire routine for the day would be finished, and I would have time to, like, to goof off or do whatever. But now it's
That's right.
just, I've been finding, I've been struggling finding motivation for things. I've been struggling finding, more creative ways of doing the things that I normally would do, and finding ways to incorporate that same routine into a new schedule, into a
Mhm.
new way. So I think a lot of people struggle with that, and one of the things that I wanted to highlight is, like, I think it's like 30% of the United States has depression or has been diagnosed with depression or something like that. It might be a little bit more, a little bit less, but
Yeah,
I'm
I think it's higher than that.
higher than that.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah,
thought so.
yeah.
And which in and of itself provides a much deeper problem. So um I know, how do you support someone with depression? I know there are some things that you can do, like you can be apathetic, you can be patient, and you can tell them that you're willing to listen. So how do you combat, how do you support someone? How do you be a support system for someone who has these things, who has these?
Absolutely. Yes, that's a great question. And so let me first attack something or address something that you said that I think is very important. So not attack, but highlight. You said, I have this routine and I know what I need to do, but the motivation. Yes, and that's the key here because we can all sit and talk about do A, B, C, D, E, and you'll feel better. But it's the motivation that is lacking. And the motivation is hurting. Our energy is low because now the chemicals are not flowing through our bodies as it normally would because we don't have those outlets and resources. So, again, the endorphins that you get from exercising or just from being able to leave your home and experience natural light in different settings, like it does something to the system that keeps us motivated and going. But when we are consumed and limited to one space where we're at home and we're trying to make all this other stuff happen in our homes, we don't have the same chemical reaction or response that's going to have that motivation and that energy going. And so that motivation is huge. And it's also indicative of depression. So, to get to your question about how do we support people who are depressed, the way to kind of balance depression, number one, is we have to have conversations to kind of see how people are thinking and processing information. So, what are you responding to, and what kind of thoughts are you having about it? Because it's the self-defeating thoughts that leads to more self-defeating behaviors. So, if you tend to be very negative or pessimistic in your view, then that's going to feed the depression. So, that's on the mental side. Physiologically is you got to get those endorphins going so it can increase some motivation and energy. So you want to make sure that you are exercising, you are getting adequate sleep, you go to bed and sometimes we have to train our bodies, right? I'm going to go to bed at 9 o'clock and I'm going to get up at 6 o'clock a.m. regardless, because the more routine and structure you have to your body, the better it can combat any kind of depression, anxiety, etc. The other thing is connected to deficiency with vitamin D. So not only are we dealing with the pandemic and we have all these limitations, but it's also the winter seasonal pattern changes, which comes with, mood disorder, and people have a struggle because we don't have as much daylight. The days seem shorter. The weather is getting cold. It's the holiday season. Most people think of that in a positive way and think it's celebratory, but most people struggle during the holiday season. So we have all of these different variables that are feeding into negative energy, negative mood, depressive states. And so we have to not only think about it mentally, but physiologically with the exercise, the eating, to make sure we're taking vitamin D supplements and we're taking care of our bodies to kind of help combat that. Spiritually, we want to make sure that we stay connected. We want to make sure we're staying connected with our families, our social outlets. We want to make sure we're able to either meditate or pray if that's what we do. But we want to make sure that we understand that regardless of things that are happening currently, there's something greater than myself, that I understand, that I have faith that it's going to also help get us through. And so we just want to make sure when we're dealing with depression, we're looking at it from the mind, body, and spirit. So we take care of our mental by having those conversations, being open and honest about what we're feeling, what we're thinking, making sure we're doing the physiological work in terms of taking care of our physical health, making sure that we have rituals and routine and that we are using meditation and prayer and connecting socially, even going outside to connect with nature and just finding these different kind of creative outlets and nurturing experiences that kind of help combat the depression. We need to do all of that. And then again, more importantly, we have to begin to normalize these experiences, not feel bad about it, not feel shame, not feel guilty, because when we do that, it just perpetuates the ongoing cycle. So we have to be able to say, hey, I'm feeling depressed. This is normal. This is what I'm thinking. This is how I'm feeling. And because I think and feel this way, I'm going to now select certain things to do that's going to help balance that, that's going to be more healthy and adaptive versus unhealthy and maladaptive.
I completely agree. A lot of times, my brother is a psychologist, and he's not a psychologist yet because he hasn't graduated yet, but he's studying psychology. And one of his synopsises is, right, he says that a lot of times people garner self-sabotage because they don't take enough time to be outside of their minds. And just like what you said, you don't you take the opportunity to, you know, go out and enjoy nature. And I think what that does is provide an out of mind experience, out of body experience, whatever.
Yeah.
And for a second you realize that the world is not just your mind, you know. And I do this all the time. Like I take a look at my hands, right? And I realize that I am real and I am in reality and I'm not in my mind, even though I'm just a floating brain piloting a body. You know what I mean? This is not who I am. My thoughts aren't who I am, right? My thoughts are only real to me. So a few of the happiness chemicals that there are, right? The brain needs these four chemicals to be happy, right? It needs dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins, right?
That's right.
You know, and so it's difficult for people to understand that dopamine is not the only, you know, the only uh, chemical that the brain needs, or the only chemical that the brain experiences. So what do you think is some of the more important things? Like what brings out these other chemicals in the brain?
Yeah, and so it's a balance of all, because those different chemicals support different areas of the brain, and has implications as it relates to if we develop like depression, anxiety, or something more severe, depending on if those chemicals are imbalanced or off in some way. But the interesting thing is, because things are kind of off balance and we need those happy chemicals. Do you know how people are achieving that? Which is also something that's very common, that I'm hearing a lot about. People are talking a lot about it, but we're talking about it in a way that's so negative that it's, again, creating more distress. But so now we're leaning towards food to help with that balance, right? And so we're craving things like sugar, carbs, and chocolate, because it does feel like it's replacing those happy chemicals that we probably are deficient with or are off balance right now. And so we're getting the feel good from carbs, sugar, and chocolate. People are upset about the weight gain, the COVID weight, and all this other stuff that is going on. But you're right, we need that. And the way to achieve it is, again, taking care of the physical body. Not necessarily that you have to go and take medication, but you have to find ways to stimulate your system where things are becoming more balanced. Again, exercising does that. Eating a well-balanced meal does that. Getting adequate sleep does that, right? Being able to talk therapy does that. So a lot of times when we hear about depression, the first thing we hear, and the reason we reject it, is because, oh, that means we have to take medication. When the first line of treatment for depression is therapy. And therapy has proven to be just as effective as antidepressants. So it doesn't necessarily have to come to that. Sometimes it's necessary. And I do support that, but it doesn't necessarily mean because you are depressed and because your chemicals are imbalanced that you have to take medication. Talk therapy is helpful. A physical routine is helpful. A spiritual outlet is helpful. Social outlets and connections are helpful. All of these things collectively, holistically, helps to combat and fight depression, anxiety, and some of the other mental health disorders we might experience.
And that's a good note too, because a lot of times people only recognize, you know, the feel goods, you know what I mean? They, instead of going out and actually doing these things, there's a stigma to just getting out there and you know, being somewhere else, you know what I mean? And even given with the pandemic, that is a little bit more difficult and a little less achievable. For example, one of my friends, she said that it's been so long since she's been outside, because she's just been quarantining her house because she's just kind of afraid of everything right now, you know? And she said that she went to the doctor, and the doctor told her that she has a vitamin D deficiency. And it was funny because she was like, sometimes I sit in front of the window and that sunlight be hitting me just right. And I'm like, you still need to go outside, you know what I mean? And experience, you know.
Yeah.
So a lot of times people tend to mistake that, and they replace those things for, you know, for the things that they need. And I think it's concerning to me that given the circumstances of the pandemic, many people are not willing to, you know, stay inside. And this plays on their mental health. So what toll do you think that takes on people?
You said not staying inside or staying inside?
Staying inside.
Yeah, we're not meant to stay inside. In fact, we are meant to be outside. And so I think that, and again, part of the concern with the pandemic and how information has been disseminated or communicated throughout the different media platforms, there's a lot of inaccurate and misinformation, or the information is shared in a way where it's very rigid and it's not offering alternatives. So it's like, don't go outside, or if you do, wear your mask. But the reality is there are things you can do. I mean, if you have a porch or a balcony, go sit on it. If you live on campus or in a neighborhood, go for a walk. You're not interacting with people. Go walk a trail. There's things that you can do. And I think outside of your home that will keep you safe. So I think that how the information is either being communicated or even perhaps how people are internalizing it, because it is scary. And so it is also creating a lot of social anxiety or agoraphobia, where people don't even want to leave their homes. So those are two other mental health disorders that we're not necessarily talking about that is now heightened as a result of the pandemic. But again, being outside is the most important thing for us right now. Staying in the house and being in a house isolated is a key ingredient to depression, anxiety, and other mental health disorders. We have to get out, enjoy nature, experience it, be mindful, do some meditation out there. We have to keep our relationships and our connections going. No, we probably can't be in large gatherings or around people. But again, we are now in a culture where we don't really pick up the phone and call people anymore. People are just texting or using social media. And again, although I think social media has been great in terms of keeping some relationships and connections going, it's also detrimental. Too much social media is negative and perpetuates depression and anxiety because of the negative information or some of the things that are shared on those platforms. So we need both, and we still need to be able to pick up a phone, call. They have all these FaceTime apps or whatnot where you can actually see people. Although you can't, and again, physical touch is also very important. Touch is important, but we can't necessarily be around our loved ones and touch them. We still have to keep our distance because we don't know what's happening with this deadly virus that's going around. So we have to be able to do all of these things and just not limit ourselves to what's in the comfort of our home, because again, that has a detrimental impact as well.
I think so too. I think one of the main things that we focus on is how hard it can be to not maintain those connections. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And for people who are very family oriented, it's very difficult for them to, to not be able to be in contact with them. And it goes back to what I was saying before. So some people they literally live on social media, and as a result, they become a product of their environment. I mean, whatever they see, whatever they do, whatever they hear, whatever influences that they see on these social media platforms, they will emulate. And I think a lot of times it's important to take a step away from that and take a step outside of your mind. And one of the best things about taking a step out of that, and one of the best things about a drastic shift in routine is that it teaches you something. You know what I mean? I think there's a positive note that we can pull out of this. I think what the pandemic has taught us more than anything is to just take a step back from our often very busy routine and just be. Just
That's
be.
right. Just be. That's right. That's right. Very important. But it's hard to do that when the stress and the stressors are just what everybody is experiencing, hearing about, seeing about, reading about every day. It's hard to just be. So we have to turn off that noise and again, limit the access, not completely get off, but limit the access. Too much of anything is never a good idea. Too little of anything is never a good idea. So we got to achieve a balance where we're staying educated, knowledgeable, and connected, but also not putting ourselves in a position where we're being overstimulated by negativity and anxiety provoking information, because that's not working well for us either.
another quote that I got it's from this YouTube channel. It's like his name is Belief in Fatherhood, right? And he was like, what it is, life isn't a balance. A balance isn't a good way to describe how human beings manage life, because a balance it simulates an even weight between two, between two or more objects, right? You know what I mean? And with that said, it's difficult for us as humans who have 7, 8 different things to worry about, 10, 12 for all we know. And the best thing to do is to learn how to juggle so that everything gets the appropriate amount of attention. And when something falls down, you can keep it up. You know what I mean? So I think it's more important that human beings learn how to juggle rather than to balance. You know what I mean? So that way we can give an equal amount of attention to each thing that we are responsible for, including ourselves. And I think it's just a good note to have. I think that's all the questions that I have for you. I really appreciate you participating in this interview this morning. It was really insightful. I really had a good time with this conversation.
Okay. Well, wonderful. Thank you for having me and wanting to interview. I'm always open and willing to share this information. I think it's very important. So I actually appreciate you reaching out and having this conversation because it's important. And the more we can have these kinds of conversations, I think the better off we will be as a people, as a community, and as a country. So thank you for your time and your work.
You're so welcome.